You've been on this journey for a while now, long enough to notice that something inside you has changed, not in the dramatic, chaotic way it once did, but in a quieter, almost unsettling calmness that makes you question everything all over again. And you're left wondering whether this peace means you've finally arrived somewhere real, or whether you've simply gone numb, or whether the entire awakening process has slowly dissolved into something ordinary, leaving you standing in a life that looks the same from the outside, but feels completely different from within. That confusion is not a setback, it's not a failure, it's a threshold, because while most people talk endlessly about how awakening begins, the chaos, the sleepless nights, the emotional breakdowns, the identity collapse, almost nobody talks about how it ends, how it settles, how it becomes so quiet that you almost miss it entirely if you're still expecting something dramatic. And this is where most people get stuck, not in the chaos, but in the calm that follows it. Carl Jung described this process as individuation, the long and often brutal journey of becoming who you truly are beneath conditioning, beneath survival patterns, beneath the version of yourself you had to construct just to belong. And what he discovered at the end of that journey is something most people aren't prepared for, because it doesn't look like enlightenment the way it's sold to you. It doesn't feel like a constant high. It doesn't announce itself. It looks ordinary. It feels quiet. It feels like a life that no longer needs to prove anything. And if you've been sensing this shift lately, there's something you need to hear clearly. You might not be lost. You might not be stuck. You might be standing exactly where the process was always leading you, and there are 7 quiet signs that reveal when that shift has already happened, even if you haven't fully recognized it yet. But here's the part most people misunderstand. One of these signs, especially sign 5, directly contradicts everything you've been taught about growth and self-improvement. And if you really understand it, it will change how you see your entire journey. So stay with this, because by the time we reach the end, you may realize something you haven't fully allowed yourself to admit yet. You're no longer in the storm. You're standing on the other side of it. Now let's discuss signs. Sign 1. You no longer need to be right. There was a time when being right felt like oxygen, not just intellectually but emotionally, because it wasn't about truth, it was about survival, about securing your identity in a world that constantly made you question your place in it, where every disagreement felt like a subtle threat, and every contradiction felt like a quiet invalidation of who you were, and so you defended, sometimes out loud, sometimes silently, but always internally, because being right meant being safe. It meant your existence couldn't be dismissed. But now something has shifted in a way that is almost invisible from the outside, yet undeniable within you, because the urgency to correct people, to prove your point, to make sure others understand you, has softened, not because you've become passive, and not because you've stopped caring, but because you no longer feel incomplete when someone disagrees with you. Their perspective no longer destabilizes your sense of self, and you can sit in a conversation where someone completely misunderstands you, and instead of tension rising in your chest, you feel space. A quiet, grounded space where you can choose whether responding even matters, and often you realize it doesn't, because not everything needs to be corrected, and not everything needs to be proven, and that realization marks a level of inner stability that most people never reach, where your identity is no longer dependent on external agreement, and your sense of self no longer needs constant reinforcement. And this is not weakness, this is integration. Because for the first time you are no longer fighting to be seen, you simply are. Sign 2. You begin to find beauty in ordinary moments. There was a phase where everything had to feel extraordinary, where you were chasing signs, synchronicities, moments that felt bigger than life itself, because those moments reassured you that something meaningful was happening, that your transformation was real, that you were progressing, and ordinary life in comparison felt dull, almost like a distraction from something more important. But now something subtle has shifted, because you find yourself sitting in moments that would have once felt insignificant, and instead of feeling restless, you feel present, not in a forced or practiced way, but in a natural and effortless way, where a quiet morning, the sound of distant noise, the way light moves across a wall, begins to feel enough. And what's even more powerful is that you're no longer trying to make these moments meaningful. You're not turning them into lessons or signs. You're simply experiencing them as they are. And in that simplicity, something profound happens. Because the seeking mind begins to dissolve. The constant hunger for something more begins to fade, and in its place, something quieter emerges. Appreciation without expectation, presence without performance, and you begin to realize that life is not made of peak experiences. It is made of moments. And when those moments are no longer overlooked or dismissed, life itself becomes deeper, richer, and more real than anything you were chasing before. Sign 3. Loneliness no longer feels threatening. There was a time when loneliness felt like something you had to escape, something heavy and uncomfortable that forced you to face parts of yourself you didn't yet understand, amplifying your doubts, your insecurities, your unresolved emotions, and so you filled it with people, distractions, noise, anything that could keep you from sitting with it for too long. But awakening stripped those distractions away and left you face to face with yourself. And for a while that felt unbearable, because without external validation, you were left with a question most people never ask honestly. Who are you when no one is watching, when no one is affirming your existence? But now something has changed. The loneliness hasn't disappeared, but it has transformed. It no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like space. Space where you don't have to perform. Space where you don't have to adjust yourself to fit expectations. Space where you can simply exist as you are. And in that space, something important happens, because you begin to realize that being alone is not the same as being disconnected. In fact, it can be the opposite, because in solitude you are no longer divided, you become whole in your own presence. And from that wholeness, your relationship with others changes. You no longer seek people to fill something missing within you. You connect because you want to share something that is already complete. Sign 4. Silence begins to feel like home. Silence used to feel uncomfortable, almost intrusive, because it had a way of surfacing everything you weren't ready to face, unresolved thoughts, buried emotions, unanswered questions. And so you filled it with noise, distractions, constant stimulation, anything to avoid being alone with yourself. And what most people don't expect is that awakening often makes this discomfort even stronger at first, because as your awareness increases, so does your sensitivity. And silence doesn't just reveal what's inside you, it amplifies it. But when the cycle matures, something shifts. Silence no longer feels like something you need to escape. It feels like something you can rest in, where you no longer reach for your phone automatically, and you no longer feel the need to fill every empty moment, and you can sit in stillness and feel genuinely present, not restless, not distracted, but grounded. And in that silence, you begin to feel something deeper than thought, something more stable than emotion, something that isn't shaped by the external world. And you realize that silence was never empty. It was always full. And once you experience that fullness, you understand something fundamental. You are no longer afraid of yourself. Sign 5. The need to constantly improve yourself begins to fade. This is the one that most people resist, because everything you've been taught tells you that growth should never stop, that you should always be improving, always becoming better, always working on yourself. But beneath that constant drive, there is often a hidden belief that who you are right now is not enough. And what changes now is not that growth stops, but that the pressure behind it dissolves, because you stop treating yourself like a problem that needs to be fixed. You begin to meet yourself where you are, fully and honestly, without immediately trying to change what you see. And at first, this can feel uncomfortable, even wrong, as if you're losing progress. But the opposite is happening, because when you stop forcing growth, real growth begins. The parts of you that were previously resisted begin to integrate naturally, and you realize that growth is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more of who you already are. And that shift removes the urgency, the pressure, the constant dissatisfaction, because you are no longer chasing worthiness, you are standing in it. Sign 6. Criticism no longer shakes you the same way. There was a time when criticism could stay with you for days, replaying in your mind, creating doubt, triggering insecurity, because somewhere along the way, you learned that your worth depended on how others perceived you. But now something has shifted. You can hear criticism without immediately internalizing it. You can observe it, evaluate it, without letting it define you. And there is space now between what is said and how you feel about yourself, where you might still feel a brief reaction, a momentary sting, but it passes. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't consume you, because your sense of self is no longer built on external perception. It is rooted in something deeper, something more stable, and you begin to understand that most people's opinions reflect their own perspectives, their own limitations, their own experiences. And while feedback can still be useful, it no longer determines your worth. And this creates a quiet kind of resilience, where you are no longer fragile in the face of judgment. You are grounded. Sign 7. You begin doing things without an audience. This is the most subtle and the most powerful sign of all, because it doesn't look like anything special from the outside. It just looks like someone doing something alone. But in a world where almost everything is performed, where even personal moments are shaped for visibility, this is rare, because at some point you may have noticed that even your experiences carried a subtle awareness of being seen, as if part of your mind was always observing, framing, preparing to present. But now, something has changed. You begin to do things simply because you want to, not because they will be seen, not because they will be validated, not because they will be appreciated, and you create something without sharing it. You experience something beautiful without needing to capture it. You spend time on something that leaves no trace, and feel completely fulfilled by it. And in that shift you return to something deeply authentic. Because when there is no audience, there is no performance. There is only you and the experience itself, and you begin to realize that the value of an experience does not come from being witnessed. It comes from being lived, and that realization changes everything, because you are no longer living for observation. You are living from within. And here is the truth about all of this. None of these signs look dramatic. None of them feel like a grand arrival. There is no moment where everything suddenly clicks and you feel complete. The end of an awakening cycle is quiet, almost ordinary. And that is exactly the point, because everything you went through, the confusion, the breakdowns, the identity shifts, was never leading you somewhere else. It was bringing you back to yourself. Not a perfected version, not a flawless version, but a whole version. The version that includes both light and shadow, and no longer feels the need to reject either. And these signs are not an ending. They are evidence. Evidence that something within you has stabilized, that you are no longer the same person who began this journey, that you have moved through the fire, and this calm, quiet, almost unremarkable moment you are standing in right now. If you are honest with yourself, this is what you were searching for the entire time. Welcome home. And if something in this message resonated with you, if you felt that quiet recognition, that subtle,